I spent 23 years building a life that most men only dream about. A cardiology practice with my name on the door, a 4-bedroom house on the lake in Woodlands, Texas, and a family I would have traded none of it for. Then my wife looked me in the eyes and told me I was suffocating her, that my questions were controlling, that my concern was a cage. She said it with such calm certainty that for a moment I almost believed her. That night, while she slept, I opened her laptop. What I found didn't just break my marriage. It showed me exactly who I had been sleeping next to for over 2 decades. My name is Webb. I'm 51 years old, and I am a cardiologist at Houston Methodist. I have spent my career fixing broken hearts, which makes what happened to mine feel like a cruel joke from the universe. My wife Diana and I met in our late 20s at a hospital fundraiser. She was finishing her nursing degree and volunteering at the event. She had this laugh that could fill a room and these bright brown eyes that made you feel like the most important person she'd ever looked at. We got married 2 years later, in a small ceremony in Austin, with 40 people and a borrowed tuxedo. We have 2 sons together. Our oldest, Brennan, is 22 and just started his first year of law school at UT Austin. Our younger son, Tyler, is 19 and studying mechanical engineering at Texas A&M. 4 years ago, we became the foster parents of a 9-year-old girl named Sophie. Her biological parents had lost custody after a long history of neglect, and she came to us skinny and quiet and suspicious of kindness. Diana had pushed hard for fostering, and I had been all in. Watching Sophie slowly uncoil, watching her learn to trust a dinner table and a bedtime routine and 2 adults who showed up every single day was the most meaningful thing I had ever done outside of medicine. We finalized her adoption 18 months ago. She is 13 now, loud about baseball statistics, and calls me dad like she's been doing it her whole life. That family, those 3 kids, that house on the lake, I thought I understood what I had. Turns out I understood far less than I believed. The first sign came 11 months ago, though I didn't recognize it as a sign at the time. Diana had been teaching yoga at a wellness studio in the Heights for 7 years. She loved it in the way people love something that also defines them. But around last spring, something shifted. She started staying late after classes for what she described as instructor meetings with the studio owner, a man named Grant Calloway, who had opened a second location and was supposedly restructuring the entire staff schedule. I didn't think much of it. Diana had always been dedicated to her work, and Grant had always been just a name on the lease as far as I was concerned. Then she started driving to the studio on her days off. She said she was covering for a sick colleague. Then she began taking calls in the backyard, sitting in the garden chair by the fence, keeping her voice low. When I asked what she was working on, she would say scheduling conflicts or billing questions, and she'd give me this look, patient, a little weary, like I was a child asking why the sky was blue for the 4th time that week. I let it go. I was busy. Cardiology does not ease up because your instincts are trying to tell you something. I had procedures, consultations, a research paper I was co-authoring, and a 13-year-old who needed help with her social studies project on the American Revolution. Life was full. I chose full over suspicious for longer than I should have. The crack that I couldn't paper over came on a Tuesday evening in October. Sophie and I had just gotten back from her baseball practice, and I was heating up the leftover pasta Diana had said she'd made. When I opened the fridge, there was no pasta. There was no sign that anyone had cooked anything. I texted Diana asking where she was. She replied 20 minutes later, saying she'd gone back to the studio to pick up a forgotten bag and grab dinner on the way home, since she wasn't sure what time she'd be in. She came home an hour after that. No bag. When I asked about it, she said she'd left it in her car. Fine. People forget things. But I stood in the kitchen after she went upstairs and I felt something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. I started paying attention differently after that. Not obsessively, not accusatorially, just quietly and carefully the way I approach a tricky diagnosis. I noticed that Diana's phone had a new passcode she'd never shared with me. I noticed she had started deleting her text previews so nothing showed on the lock screen. I noticed she came home twice a week smelling like a restaurant we had never been to together. I mentioned it one evening when the kids were in bed. I said I felt like we'd been on different planets lately. I said I missed her. That simple, that honest. Diana set down her book and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as rehearsed patience. Marcus, she said, I am exhausted. I teach 6 classes a week. I manage the household calendar. I coordinate Sophie's therapy appointments, and I make sure this family runs. I don't need you monitoring my schedule on top of all of that. That's not monitoring, I said. That's a conversation. She picked her book back up. You're suffocating me, she said quietly. You always need to know everything. There's nothing to know. Those words sat in my ribcage for the rest of the night. I don't know what made me do what I did that Saturday morning when Diana announced she was heading to the studio for a workshop prep session. Something about the way she said it. Too casual. Too quick. Sophie was at a friend's birthday party. I said I had some journal articles to catch up on and watched her back out of the driveway. Then I sat down at the kitchen table with her laptop. She'd left it on the counter, something she almost never did anymore. I stared at it for several minutes before I opened it. Her email was still logged in. I want to tell you that I felt guilty doing it, but what I actually felt was dread. The deep anticipatory dread of a man who already knows what he's about to find and is only building the courage to look. The inbox had dozens of messages from Grant Calloway.wellness. I didn't click the most recent one first. I scrolled to the beginning, 3 months ago, and I read forward. By the time I reached the present, I had been sitting at that table for 45 minutes, and my coffee had gone completely cold. Grant Calloway was not just her employer. He was the man she had been meeting at the Hotel Sorella in City Center every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 4 months. He was the man she had spent a weekend with in San Antonio in September, when she told me she was attending a yoga certification seminar. He was the man she was writing things to that no one had written to me in years. One email from Diana stopped me cold. She had written, "He keeps asking about my schedule and why I'm coming home later. I think he's starting to figure it out. Can we be more careful?" Grant's reply. "Or you could just tell him the truth. You deserve to be happy, Diana. You deserve someone who actually sees you." I closed the laptop. I walked to the back door and stood looking at the lake for a long time. By the time Diana came home 2 hours later, I was back in the kitchen pretending to read. She kissed me on the cheek, asked if I wanted lunch. I said sure. We made sandwiches together and talked about Sophie's baseball season and whether Tyler was eating enough at college, and I performed normal so convincingly that I almost frightened myself. That evening, I called my older brother Dion. He is an attorney in Dallas, family law, and one of the only people in the world whose judgment I trust without qualification. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Marcus, don't say anything to her yet. Document everything first." I followed his advice. Over the next 2 weeks, I photographed the emails. I checked our joint credit card statements, which I had been neglecting for months because Diana handled our household finances. What I found made me sit down in my office with the door closed and my head in my hands. Hotel Sorella twice a week for 4 months. Restaurants in Montrose and Midtown I didn't recognize. A jewelry purchase at a boutique in River Oaks for $412. Weekend charges at a hotel in San Antonio that didn't match a single yoga certification course I could find online. A pattern of Venmo transfers to an account I didn't recognize, totaling $9,000 over 5 months. $9,000. Not a catastrophic number compared to some of the cases Dion had described, but money transferred in deliberate increments. $300 here, $500 there. Suggesting someone who knew exactly what she was doing and was trying not to trigger any alarms. I called Dion back. He referred me to a colleague in Houston, a family attorney named Patricia Okafor, who specialized in high-asset divorce cases. We met in her office on a Thursday afternoon, and I laid out everything I had. Patricia was calm and thorough and methodical. She said we needed surveillance documentation to corroborate the financial records for a custody proceeding. She referred me to an investigator named Joe Tran. Joe was former law enforcement and had been doing this work for 12 years. We met at a coffee shop in Midtown. He looked at what I had and said, "Whoever handled the financials was sloppy. We'll have everything you need within 3 weeks." He was done in 11 days. The file he delivered included time-stamped photographs outside Hotel Sorella on 4 separate Tuesdays, restaurant receipts with both names, a record of a second Venmo account Diana had opened in a slightly different name variation, her maiden name combined with a middle initial, to which she had transferred over $14,000 from our joint savings account in 8 months, not $9,000. I had missed several of the earlier transfers entirely. $14,000. Sophie's therapy appointments were $60 a week with insurance. I had paid for every single one out of our household account, while Diana was funneling money out of the same account to fund Tuesday afternoons at a hotel 12 miles from our house. Patricia called that a pattern of financial misconduct. She said it would matter considerably in a Texas family court. The night I decided to act, Diana had just told Sophie she couldn't go to the regional baseball qualifier because it conflicted with the studio retreat Diana was attending that weekend. Sophie had nodded and gone upstairs without arguing, which was somehow worse than if she cried. This girl who had spent the first 9 years of her life being let down by the adults who were supposed to be her parents, learning once again to fold her disappointment quietly so no one would be inconvenienced by it. I told Sophie I would take her to the qualifier. Her face changed completely. She hugged me hard enough that I felt it in my spine. After Sophie went to bed, I brought Diana a glass of wine and sat across from her in the living room. "I want to ask you something directly," I said, "and I need you to be honest with me for once." Her shoulders went very still. "What is it?" I asked her about Grant Calloway. I didn't ask as a question. I stated it. I told her what I knew. The hotel, the emails, the money. She went through the stages fast. Shock, then a brief flicker of denial, then something collapsing behind her eyes. She set down the wine glass. "Marcus," she said slowly, "this is complicated. There are things in our marriage that haven't been working for years. You're never home. Even when you're here, you're not present. I was lonely," I said. "So you stole from our savings account." Her chin came up. "That money was mine too," I said. "That money was Sophie's therapy fund and Tyler's tuition buffer." She looked away. Then she said the thing. She said, "Marcus, you're overreacting. This doesn't have to become what you're making it. We can work through this with counseling. I haven't thrown anything away. I've just been looking for something I wasn't getting here." I looked at my wife of 23 years and I understood with absolute clarity that she believed what she was saying, that she had constructed a version of events in which she was the sympathetic center and I was the obstacle. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I said goodnight and I went upstairs. At 4 a.m., while Diana slept with the kind of untroubled peace that I had not managed in weeks, I got up and packed 2 bags in the dark. Medical license documents, passport, 3 weeks of clothes, my laptop, the external hard drive where I kept copies of everything Joe Tran had given me and everything I had documented myself. I moved through our bedroom like a man who had rehearsed this, because in a way, I had been rehearsing it for weeks without knowing. I left a note on the kitchen counter. It said, "I'm staying at Dion's. The kids can reach me on my cell. This is not negotiation." By sunrise, I was on I-45 heading north, and our house on the lake was shrinking in my rearview mirror. Dion made coffee and didn't ask too many questions that first morning. He had a guest room that smelled like cedar and old books, and I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before I called Brennan. My oldest took it the way Brennan takes most hard things, quietly, processing, asking careful questions. He asked if I was okay. I told him I was going to be. He said, "Dad, whatever happened, I know you didn't cause it." That simple sentence from my 22-year-old son broke something open in me that I'd been holding shut for days. Tyler called an hour later, angrier. The way 19-year-old boys express grief. He said a lot of words about loyalty and fairness that I mostly let wash over me without correction. He needed to say them. I listened. The hardest call was to Sophie. She was 13 and smart in the way kids who have survived hard things are smart. Observational, attuned to atmosphere, always reading the room. When I told her I wasn't coming home for a while, but that she could call me any time, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is this because of the man who calls Mom?" I asked her what she meant. She said she had heard Diana on the phone late at night several times, laughing in that way that didn't sound like Diana laughing at something on TV. She said she hadn't said anything because she didn't want to cause a problem. This child who had come to us afraid of causing problems was still, at 13 and after 4 years with us, tucking her distress into invisible pockets so no one would be bothered by it. I told her she had done nothing wrong. I told her she could stay with me at Uncle Dion's any weekend she wanted. I told her that no matter what happened between Diana and me, she was my daughter, and that was never going to change. She said, "Promise?" I said, "I promise you. Absolutely." And without any exceptions. She exhaled so long I could hear it through the phone. Patricia filed the initial separation paperwork that week. Diana responded through her own attorney almost immediately. Her opening position was that she had been the primary domestic caretaker of the family for years. While I worked excessive hours, that she was entitled to the lake house, substantial spousal support, and primary custody of Sophie. When Patricia showed me the filing, I sat with it for a moment. Primary custody of Sophie. The same woman who had redirected $14,000 of our savings into a private account while Sophie's trauma therapist billed us weekly. The same woman who had canceled Sophie's qualifying tournament for a hotel weekend. Patricia said, "We have everything we need. Trust the process." The financial audit my accountant ran on our joint accounts took 2 weeks and produced results worse than I had initially understood. Beyond the Venmo transfers, Diana had used a secondary credit card, one she had opened in both our names 2 years prior, which I had honestly forgotten existed, to charge over $22,000 in expenses that had no legitimate household explanation: spa treatments, boutique clothing purchases, concert tickets for two, a 4-day trip to New Orleans in February that I had been told was a yoga retreat. Total financial misconduct: $36,000 over approximately 14 months. Patricia said judges in Harris County took a dim view of this kind of thing, particularly in cases involving adopted children, where the financial harm could be directly traced to impacted resources for the child care. 3 weeks into my time at Dion's, I decided there was one conversation I needed to have that had nothing to do with lawyers or accountants. I found out where Grant Calloway's second studio location was. I drove there on a Wednesday afternoon and waited in the parking lot until I saw him walk out at closing time. Grant Calloway was 44, trim, with the particular kind of easy physical confidence that comes from spending a professional lifetime in yoga studios. He saw me the moment I got out of the car. He knew who I was. Diana would have prepared him for this possibility. He started to speak first. He said he was sorry, that it wasn't meant to go the way it did. I told him I hadn't come to hear an apology. I told him to let me say what I needed to say, and then we'd both move on. I said, "You've been involved with a married woman who has 3 children, one of whom is a 13-year-old adopted girl who has already been abandoned by one family." I said, "Whatever Diana told you about our marriage, you were not owed access to it. You chose to involve yourself anyway." I said, "As a result of what the two of you spent together, money that should have been available for my daughter's mental health treatment was redirected. I want you to understand that clearly, not as a general statement, as a fact with a specific child attached to it." Grant's jaw worked. He said he hadn't known about the financial piece, that Diana had told him she had her own accounts. I said, "Now you know. And here's what I need from you. I need you to end all contact. I need you to understand that I have surveillance documentation, financial records, and an attorney who is very good at her job. If there is any complication to our custody proceedings that I can trace back to your involvement, I will pursue every professional and civil avenue available to me. I will contact your business partners. I will make sure every person who has a stake in your studio knows exactly what kind of man they're in business with." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. He didn't say anything else. He got in his car and left. Driving back to Dion's, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not happiness, not vindication, just solid ground under my feet. I had handled it the way I wanted to. No rage, no threats. I wasn't prepared to follow through on. Clean and direct and clear. Diana called that evening. She had heard from Grant. I could tell by the brittleness in her voice. She said I had no right to confront him like that. I said I had every right as a father protecting his daughter's resources. She said I was punishing her. I said I was punishing her tout. She said those weren't mutually exclusive. I said she was right. They weren't. But I was only responsible for one of those 2 outcomes. She hung up. I sat with the quiet for a while and found I didn't mind it. The court date was set for early March. Patricia had been meticulous in her preparation. We had the financial audit documentation, the Venmo transfer records, the secondary credit card statements, the surveillance file from Joe Tran, and testimony from Sophie's therapist, presented through a professional letter rather than in person, noting that any disruption to Sophie's placement with a consistent primary caregiver would be developmentally harmful given her history. Brennan had flown in from Austin. He sat in the gallery and I could see him in my peripheral vision every time I needed to feel anchored. Diana's attorney argued the workaholic narrative with some skill. He presented a picture of a husband who had been emotionally absent, professionally consumed, and impossible to reach. There was truth mixed into it. The way there's always truth mixed into the stories estranged couples tell about each other. I had worked long hours. I had missed dinners. I had sometimes come home so wrung out from a difficult day that I had little left to give. But then Patricia presented the financials. The judge, the Honorable Sandra Whitmore, was a woman in her late 50s who had clearly heard many versions of this particular story. She went through the credit card records methodically. She noted the secondary Venmo account. She noted the gap between the stated purpose of the transfers and any documentable household expense. Diana was asked directly whether she had transferred marital funds for personal use without her spouse's knowledge. Her attorney tried to reframe it. Judge Whitmore asked the question again specifically. Diana said she had used some shared funds for personal expenses. Yes. She said she had not realized the amounts had accumulated the way they did. Judge Whitmore looked at her for a moment. She said, Mrs. Webb, $36,000 accumulated over 14 months is not an accounting oversight. The ruling came in full. I was awarded primary residential custody of Sophie, with Diana granted visitation on alternate weekends pending the completion of a financial counseling program, and 12 sessions with a licensed therapist. Brennan, as an adult, would of course determine his own relationship with his mother. Tyler, I knew, would work through his anger in his own time and arrive eventually at something more complicated than blame. Regarding marital assets, Diana received 30% of the equity in the lake house after accounting for the amount to be repaid to the marital estate. She received no claim against my medical practice, which Patricia had cleanly established as a professional entity predating the marriage. Spousal support was awarded at a modest amount for 3 years given her established career in the wellness industry. Outside the courthouse, Patricia shook my hand. She said, "You prepared well." I said, "Most of it was Dion." She smiled and said, "Let him know he can retire. I'm tired of competing with him." When I picked Sophie up from school that afternoon and told her she was coming home with me to a new apartment I had rented in the Heights, closer to her school and her team and her therapist, she stood at the curb with her backpack on and processed it for a full 30 seconds without speaking. Then she said, "Does that mean you'll come to all my games?" I said, "Every single one." She picked up her bag and got in the car. That was 6 months ago. The apartment is smaller than the lake house, but Sophie has the bigger bedroom because she doesn't know what to do with having space, and I want her to practice. Brendan calls on Sunday evenings. Tyler drove down last month, and we went to a Astros game, the three of us, and he talked the whole time and laughed easily, and I could see him finding his way back to me. Sophie has started a streak of 12 games without an error at shortstop. Her therapist told me last week that she is showing the strongest indicators of secure attachment she has observed since they began working together. My practice is doing well. My colleagues know what happened in the broad strokes that colleagues always know. Several of them have been quiet and steady and generous in ways I didn't expect, which is one of the things that surprises you about hardship. Who shows up? My partner Marcus. Different Marcus. We've been calling him Dr. Marcus too, for years as a joke. Covered 3 of my on-call weekends during the worst months without being asked. I started running again, which I had given up sometime in the busy middle of my marriage, when there was always something more pressing. I run along the Bayou Trail near the apartment most mornings at 6, and sometimes I pass the same woman walking a large brown dog who looks like it's made of equal parts fur and ambition. She nodded at me for about 2 months before we actually spoke. Her name is Claire. She's a pediatric nurse practitioner at Texas Children's, which means we spoke in the shared dialect of people who understand what a 12-hour shift in a children's hospital costs you emotionally, and why you need a 70-pound dog and a very early morning walk to reset. She's recently divorced. 2 teenage boys, funny in the dry way that people who have been through difficult things often are. We have had coffee twice. Both times felt like exhaling. I'm not in a hurry. Sophie has asked about her with the careful, watchful interest of a kid who wants to understand the situation before she has feelings about it. I told her that Claire is someone I'm getting to know, that everything in this family moves at whatever pace feels right for all of us, and that nobody and nothing comes before her. Sophie thought about that and said, "She better like baseball." I said I had already confirmed this, which is true, and Sophie seemed satisfied. Last Saturday morning I made breakfast for Sophie and her friend Priya, who had slept over after a Saturday practice. The 2 of them sat at the kitchen island eating eggs and debating which of their teammates had the strongest arm, and I stood at the stove listening to Sophie argue her position with absolute authority. The girl who came to us at 9 years old, silent and braced for disappointment. Sitting in my kitchen at 13 years old, with opinions about softball and a best friend, and the easy assumption that Saturday breakfast would simply be there. Dion came by for dinner that evening. We sat on the balcony after Sophie had gone to her room, and he asked how I was actually doing, the way he does when he wants a real answer. I told him I was better than I expected to be. He asked if I was angry. I told him I had been for a while, in the way you're angry when something you trusted turns out to have been something different than you believed. But that underneath the anger there was something else. Something that felt less like loss and more like clarity. Like I had finally stopped trying to hold a shape that had already broken and could start figuring out what the new shape was going to be. Dion said he was proud of me. I told him to shut up before I cried on his good jacket. He laughed, and we watched the city lights for a while without saying much else, which is something brothers can do if they're lucky enough to have the right kind of brother. I don't know what the next year looks like in exact terms. The divorce will finalize in another few months. Sophie will start 8th grade in August and is already researching high school programs with strong athletic programs, which means I'll be touring campuses with a 13-year-old who has more questions than a deposition. Tyler might transfer to a Houston school next year, which he's pretending to consider entirely on academic grounds, but which I suspect has at least something to do with not wanting to be 300 miles away from his sister. Brennan will finish his first year of law school and come home for the summer and talk about everything except the hard things, until one evening when he'll suddenly talk about all of them at once, because that is how Brennan has always worked. And I'll be here, in this apartment, with the good morning light, in the loud dog from downstairs, and Sophie's baseball cleats by the front door. Building the next version of things, the way you build anything worth having, one careful piece at a time, on a foundation you actually trust. I spent 23 years believing that the life I had constructed was solid because I had built it with my hands. What I understand now is that you cannot build a life by yourself, no matter how skilled you are. It takes people who are honest with you, even when honesty is inconvenient. It takes knowing the difference between someone who is present and someone who is performing presence. And it takes, occasionally, the willingness to walk away from something that stopped being real a long time ago. Even when walking away in the dark at 4 in the morning is the most frightening thing you have ever done. By morning, I was gone. It turned out that was the first step toward finding out where I actually needed to be.